This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leoneda Inge. We all know about July 4th, 1776, but do you know about May 20th, 1775? That's when some folks say the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, the MECDEC, was signed. Then poetry from the new book, We, the People of the United States by Joshua Bennett.
Every single day, I would sit down and think, okay, what figures do I want to write about? Where are they from? Where do they have deep historical ties? And how can I honor that in the work?
And the New Americans in North Carolina project looks at immigrant stories then and now.
Being able to look back into records and talk to people who have come from different countries has really put that into perspective about the long history we have and hopefully the long history we will continue to have.
All that on Due South. The news is next. From the American Tobacco Historic District in downtown Durham, this is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leoneda Inge. July 4th, 1776 is the date we all know by heart, when the 13 colonies declared their separation from Great Britain and our new nation was born. But what if I told you that right here in North Carolina, residents of Mecklenburg County stuck their necks out to declare independence a year before the country's forefathers signed that famous document? Would you believe me? It's the stuff of legend or perhaps a hoax, but May 20th, 1775 is a date enshrined on North Carolina's state flag. It represents what was supposedly the first Declaration of Independence made by any of the 13 colonies involved in the American Revolution, and is often called the MECDEC, short for the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. In the lead up to our country's 250th birthday, Due South has been revisiting some of the people, places, and events that have shaped North Carolina and American history. I spoke with Scott Seifert in May 2025, just before the 250th anniversary of the MECDEC. He's the author of the book, The First American Declaration of Independence, The Disputed History of the Mecklenburg Declaration of May 20th, 1775. And I started by asking him, what is supposed to have happened that residents in Mecklenburg County declared independence before the rest of the country?
So as the story goes, on May 19th, 1775, 26 local Charlotte-based Mecklenburg County Scots-Irish militia leaders are meeting in the log courthouse in downtown, what's now downtown Charlotte.
Mm-hmm.
And as they're meeting to discuss the deteriorating state of affairs within the British colonies, a messenger arrives who brings them news that the battles of Lexington and Concord have occurred exactly 1 month before. And they go ballistic. And over the course of 24 hours, they debate a series of resolutions that we now call the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which proclaims Mecklenburg County is, quote, free and independent, close quote, of Great Britain. And on May 20th, they read these from the courthouse steps. They all throw their hats in the air, and they proclaim the county independence. And this, of course, is the first Declaration of Independence in the American colonies. And then they decide, well, what do we do now? Right? We're a series of frontiers people living in the woods here. It's not a very wealthy city. It's not a very, populated city. So they task a local tavern owner named Captain James Jack to deliver this document to the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia to ask them, what do we do? And so Jack does this, and he takes the errand to Philadelphia. He delivers the MECDEC. But at the time, Congress is debating reconciliation with Great Britain to avert a civil war. And they say, this is not the time for this. This is premature. And they send Jack home. And that more or less would have been the end of the story, a sort of local curiosity or historical footnote in North Carolina history, except for a debate that breaks out in the 19th century about whether this happens at all, because the original papers are subsequently lost.
Right. There's no document. And I guess I've also read or not read that there's anything in any newspapers to even prove this.
So Yes and no. This is a complicated story, and it relies on a great body of circumstantial evidence, including the eyewitness testimony of 12 participants and very good eyewitnesses.
Yeah, I was about to say, they weren't everyday
leaders.
people, right? They weren't everyday.
They're not random people off the street, right? So they attest to this 50 years later. There are documents that exist. They still exist in the Chapel Hill Library, but they're all sort of ripped or undated or anonymous. And so historians cannot point to any one single piece of paper and say, this is the actual text. There is a document found in a paper, but it's dated May 31st, not May 20th. And it doesn't look or read what all the eyewitnesses say the Meckdeck should read or sound like. And so what is this? And these are called the Mecklenburg Resolves to differentiate them from the Meckdeck.
Mm-hmm.
And the skeptics of the story will say, this is all that happened. They had this meeting on May 31st. We have the paper. It's clearly legitimate, but it's not a declaration of independence. It's just an interesting anti-British meeting. Meckdeckers will tell you, no. This is truth of the whole story. On May 20th, they declared independence, and 11 days later, they had this subsequent meeting setting up a government for the county. And that's more or less where the historical debate has been frozen for 150 years.
Wow, it's a great story, and it's great history to know. So now when we, I guess, fast forward a few years, with John Adams, he came to learn about the Meckdeck. So how did he learn about it? That's a name we do know.
Right. So in the 1820s, various states are claiming primacy for who should get credit for the American Revolution. And the people in Virginia say, well, this is the story of Thomas Jefferson and so forth. It's a Virginia story. And the people of Massachusetts say, no. The American Revolution is, the result of the work of the people of Massachusetts, John Adams, Sam Adams, the Boston Tea Party, and so forth. And every state's sort of having this debate. And then people in Mecklenburg County said, well, you may not have heard of this, but actually Mecklenburg County declared independence
first,
a year before anybody else,
Yes.
right? And every other person in the country said, you're making this up, right? We've never heard of this at all. And they said, no, it's true. We have some of the existing papers. We have these eyewitnesses and so forth. We don't have the original paper. It's lost in a fire, which we freely admit, but it shouldn't matter. So they print in the Raleigh Register in 1819 a copy of the Meckdeck story. And John Adams sees it in his local paper. And he becomes very animated and writes a lengthy letter to Thomas Jefferson, his frenemy and political adversary of many years, in which he says, among other things, the genuine sense of America at that moment was never so well expressed before nor since. And to his friends, Adams is writing privately saying Jefferson must have seen this in the time of it because he's copied it verbatim.
He stole it. Yes,
he stole it. That's what Adams believed. He said he finally thinks, I've got Jefferson, who I don't like, who's a fraud, and he clearly plagiarized this.
Oh my
And so
goodness.
that set off the national controversy. And Jefferson, meanwhile, writes a very lengthy and thoughtful response, to which he says, no one's ever heard of this. I've never heard of this. And he goes on and on about the reasons it probably doesn't exist. But he leaves the door open. He says, until more solemn proof is produced, I must be a disbeliever in the apocryphal gospel. And so that sets everybody on fire. You're either with the Jeffersonians and you say the North Carolinians are making this whole thing up, or you're North Carolinians saying our state pride's been attacked and Jefferson's a fraud. And so
I'll
that
go
brings
with Jefferson is a fraud. I'm putting
right, exactly.
putting it out there. One thing I definitely want to know is, so is it possible that any word of this could have actually made it to Great Britain, made it to the crown?
It's a great question. And the answer is it did, unequivocally. In fact, that summer, in June of 1775, the last royal governor, Josiah Martin of North Carolina, writes to his superiors in London, in which he says, the enclosed newspaper, which your lordship will find with this letter, contains resolves of a committee of Mecklenburg, which surpass all the horrid and treasonable publications that the inflammatory spirits of this continent have yet produced. But the paper's never been found, right? So we don't know what's in the paper. Is it the Meckdeck? Is it the resolves? Is it something else? So the British did see it, and they reported it, and the letter made it into the British records, but not the newspaper. And the letter still exists. You can see it to this day. But until we find the newspaper, which has never been found, We simply don't know.
So are you still looking for that? I know you co-founded a group in Mecklenburg County in Charlotte called the May 20th Society. So tell me about this group and what do you all do every day?
Yeah, right. So we started this group about 20 something years ago, just because we thought this was a fun story and it was really off the radar locally and certainly statewide. And we said, this is kind of fun. Let's bring this back. So we would have an event every year around May 20th. We're like, the 4th of July Society of sorts. And so we would bring historians to Charlotte and donate them to the school system. So for 10 years, we had David McCullough, Ken Burns, Cokie Roberts, Lord Andrew Roberts, and so forth. And we would do this every year. We funded a bronze equestrian statue of Captain James Jack, which is in downtown Charlotte about 12 years ago. And we just made the commemoration bigger and bigger every year. Because as you pointed out earlier, this was a city and county holiday until the 1980s. The dates on the North Carolina state flag, this was kind of the biggest deal in North Carolina for a century, which is ironic now given how it's widely forgotten. So that's what we do. We promote the story. We try not to get too in the weeds of, because the evidence and the discussions and the controversy can bog people down. And we think it doesn't matter. It's a great story. Whatever one thinks about it, there's a huge body of evidence that exists. There's some arguments against it. So what? The fun is in the story and in building the whole celebration around it.
I spoke with Scott Seifert in 2025. He's the author of The First American Declaration of Independence, The Disputed History of the Mecklenburg Declaration of May 20th, 1775, and he's chairman of the May 20th Society. We continue today revisiting conversations about people who have shaped what our state and our country have become. Up next is an encore presentation of my conversation with poet and professor Joshua Bennett. It's about his book, We the People of the United States.
He was undermining the public argument for slavery every single time that he composed these poems.
So
right?
smart.
Because poems are proof. Right? Yeah,
So
poems
smart.
are proof he had a soul. He had an inner world. He wasn't a tractor. He wasn't a piece of equipment. He was a human being who had been wrongfully held captive, and that protest was made manifest in his art.
That's coming up. I'm Leoneda Inge, and this is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leoneda Inge, and this is Due South on WUNC News. As the United States turns 250 years old, you can count on lots of celebrating of our nation's historical icons. Many will be honored, many others will not, or at least not enough. That's why I'm so pleased to talk today with someone who has written a book that travels the country, dipping down into dozens of towns and cities, paying tribute to some of the Black historical figures who lived there. And it's not a history book. It's a book of poetry, including a poem honoring George Moses Horton. Horton was born enslaved in North Carolina and became the first African-American man to publish a book in the South. We're going to talk about all that George Moses Horton did and more with Joshua Bennett, a professor of literature and distinguished chair of the humanities at MIT. He's the author of several books of poetry, criticism, and narrative nonfiction. His new poetry collection is We, the People of the United States. Welcome so much. Glad to have you here, Joshua.
Of course, thanks so much for having me on.
Why the title We, and then in parentheses, the people of the United States?
I mean, I think it started about 3 years ago in my classroom at MIT. One of my colleagues, Christopher Spade, a poet and a critic, he came into our class to talk about his idea of something he called the lyric we, this way that poets would take up the plural pronoun we to gesture toward this broader collective or group. And I just started thinking, who's in my we? right?
Mm.
Certainly my wife and children, my family back in New York, the other poets around the world, the members of Messiah Baptist Church in Yonkers when I was a little boy. And then I just started thinking about the nation and about the world. And that became the start of this book. So I wanted to take that language from history, from the preamble, and create something new from it.
You know, there are so many untold Black stories from our country's history still today. How did you choose the people and places to honor? I know some of those Southern spots from the book. I enjoyed seeing that list, including Eatonville, Florida.
Is Ornell Hurston's poem. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so what's important to mention here, too, is that my grandmother is from Wilmington, North Carolina. That's what she met my grandfather in a strawberry field. And they moved up north to New York City, which is where my mother met my father. My father is from Fairfield, Alabama. One of 21 children. And so we have deep roots in the South in my family on both sides. And I just thought a lot about the historical and literary figures that have meant the most to me over the course of my life. So naturally, Zora Neale Hurston was there, Frederick Douglass was there, Ralph Ellison was there, and George Moses Horton was there, from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so that's really how I started the poems. Just every single day, I would sit down and think, okay, what figures do I want to write about? Where are they from? Where do they have deep historical ties? And how can I honor that in the work?
On Due South, we noticed that even though you're covering the whole country with this book of poetry, you mentioned the South a lot, just like you just mentioned your grandparents.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though my mother was born and raised in the Bronx, she spent her summers in North Carolina. And so much of my family history, when I would hear it recited as a little boy growing up in New York, the geographic kind of landscape was Southern. The stories were Southern, the food was, the music was. We would go down south to visit my cousins sometimes in North Carolina, and that's where we would hold our family reunions. And even some of my father's brothers and sisters who didn't move to New York, they stayed in Virginia. And so going to the South was a major part of my childhood and my intellectual formation. And many of the writers I've written about since, people like Richard Wright, from Mississippi, it's Southern writers through and through when you talk about the work that calls out to me and speaks to me from our tradition.
Well, we're going to talk about George Moses Horton and his connection to Chapel Hill. But are there other Southern Black historical icons? I know you just mentioned a few that really stick out for you from this poetry collection. Of course, I had to mention Zora Neale Hurston.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, their eyes are watching God, right? The novel published in 1937. It's a book I wrote about in my dissertation, but it's also something that completely changed the way that I thought about life on Earth. She has that powerful scene of the funeral for Matt Bonner's mule. I don't know if you remember this scene, but she talks about mule heaven, this idea that when mules die, they go to a version of heaven where mules ride around on people. And ever since I
Yes.
read that passage, many years ago in college and then again in graduate school, I just thought, what an imagination to imagine a world of relation without rank, right? Where you imagine that animals too will have their day, have their paradise, and that it would look radically different than the world we have right now. I was just really moved by that sensibility, that sense of oneself as an earthling, as being in deep conversation and relationship with the animals and with the flowers. And that's the same sensibility that my father raised me with. And so I really wanted to make sure it had its own presence in the scholarship.
Do you remember when you first learned about George Moses Horton? How old were you and what were you told?
Yeah, so I was a graduate student at the time at Princeton. And actually, I was walking through a used bookstore in New York where I moved after my first year of graduate school, physically living in Princeton. And I found this book on the shelf called The Black Bard of North Carolina, George Moses Horton and His Poetry. It was edited by Joan R. Sherman, I believe published in 1997. And I was blown away, not just by the gorgeous poems themselves, but by his story and the idea of this man who could neither read nor write on paper, but could compose these gorgeous poems in his head. I was also taken aback by the idea of a Black man in 1865 publishing a book called Naked Genius, a book with genius in the title. It just seemed to me to, again, be this kind of radical reversal of expectations, born, though, of a deep familiarity with Black people, with Black social life, and the knowledge that we have always had geniuses among us, whether or not they were recognized within the broader public sphere. So, yeah, I was about 22, 23 years old, and I found this book on the shelf, and it changed everything.
Would you please read your poem for George Moses Horton? It's titled Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Absolutely. Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for George Moses Horton. What was held in the young man's thinking were concentric worlds, angels' arrangements, relentless genius set loose from the page's gray enclosure. Imagine the scene. George's invisible compositions populate and then take hold of the sunlit air. The college green in Chapel Hill, his dedicated stage. Crowds gathering to hear the monumental bard hold court. Elegies in the outlines of birds. World pictures of the landscape that would outlive him. Not unlike the lines themselves, for years etched only onto the space between passers-by on the way to class, an ancient art revived in the flesh of a prodigy in chains. 17, the same age as freshman, placing quarters at his feet as he sells the sounds the engine in his head makes. And these in lieu of the produce he is sent there to trade, which he wrestles from the earth with hands and horse-drawn plow while sketching silently the image of the beloved in his mind. One he has never met, but has been hired to celebrate in song, which he will, once the colors and dimensions are perfected, of the rooms he is building, in a place beyond matter no mortal can see.
What was he doing, I guess, on campus, at the University of North Carolina? And how did he, just start doing this? Can I'd like you to further paint this picture of Horton.
Yeah, I mean, so part of what he ostensibly was doing was selling fruits and vegetables at Chapel Hill Farmers Market. And from the histories I've read, he just became known for kind of being there on campus and reciting these poems. And a particular scene I was trying to really convey in this poem was this idea of these college students, these college freshmen who would pay him quarters to write love poems, for their girlfriends, right? Or the people they liked, the people they cared about. And that image really stuck with me. How was it possible that in a moment where Black people were considered property, that nonetheless the space of something as cherished and as crucial and as fundamentally human as a love poem, right? That you would ask a Black man to compose that for you, right? And not just compose it, but also give it to this person that you cared about. I just thought it was such a fascinating moment of the actual truth of our shared humanity shining forth, even in the midst of something like slavery, which is a general catastrophe. So that's part of the picture I was trying to paint. But he would be there, no pen, no pad, and he would compose these beautiful lyric poems in his head. And eventually, a woman named Caroline Lee Whiting Hentz, who was a professor's wife and a writer herself, she transcribed his poetry and helped publish it in her hometown newspaper.
What genius. What genius. And of course, he publicly protested his slavery through poetry. That's very powerful. Yeah. And he tried to buy his emancipation with those earnings. So, I mean, that, absolutely. Yeah, he was involved in his, as they say, past, present, and future with that genius mind.
Yeah, and he eventually lived. I mean, he was enslaved for 68 years and then eventually moved to Philadelphia and lived almost 20 more years, but before his death in 1883. So, yeah, thank you for that gesture, too, towards the future of Horton, right? I think with poems, often what we're trying to do is capture a moment in amber, sometimes a single or only several scenes. But he was a human being who lived a full life, always protested the conditions of his enslavement. And I think in the performance of his poetry, much like someone like Phyllis Wheatley, who lived much earlier, right? He was undermining the public argument for slavery every single time that he composed these poems.
So
right?
smart.
Because poems are proof. Right? Yeah,
So
poems
smart.
are proof he had a soul. He had an inner world. He wasn't a tractor. He wasn't a piece of equipment. He was a human being who had been wrongfully held captive and that protest was made manifest in his art.
Joshua Bennett is a professor of literature and distinguished chair of the humanities at MIT. His new poetry collection is We, the People of the United States. How much of your work is about or dedicated to your family, to your children, and are they in most everything that you do?
It's a phenomenal question. I was just talking to my wife about this in the kitchen, so it's so funny. Yeah, I think, my family made me a poet.
Mhm.
I've always had stage fright since I was about 4 years old. And nonetheless, my parents would encourage me to perform in church plays, to get up and recite scripture or perform my own poems or, do a bit of Bobby Brown choreography at our Christmas Day talent shows
What?
that would take place in oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In my grandmother's living room in the South Bronx, the whole family would get together, all my aunts and uncles and cousins, and the kids would have to perform in a talent show. And my mother, she would say, it's okay to be scared, but you have to trust your voice and you have a gift, Joshua. So you have to share it because that's what gifts are for. It's not just to make you rich or look smart. Your gifts are meant to go out into the world and beautify it, and to lift burdens off of people. And so, yeah, my family now that I'm building my own family with my wife, Pamela, here in Massachusetts, it's not just that my family members appear in my poetry, but they're the people who animate my writing in every way that's meaningful for me. I think every time I sit down to write poems, I too am trying to make an argument about the beauty of human experience, the idea that love is worthwhile, and that we live for each other.
We have a piece of tape we'd like to play. It's of you in 2009 at the White House performing in front of President Barack Obama. But before we listen, please set up how old were you and how did you get to the White House?
Goodness. So that was May of 2009.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have been about 20 years old. I was a junior in college at the University of Pennsylvania. And Stan Lathan, the famed filmmaker, produced that event and producer, a television producer, produced that event. And he called me maybe 2 weeks before and said, hey, do you want to come to the White House and perform a poem? You have 2 minutes. The theme is communication and you can bring a single +1. So I brought my mom with me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, what is the poem you perform for the, what is it called?
It's called Tamara's Opus. It's from my older sister, Tamara.
Tamara has never listened to hip-hop, never danced to the rhythm of raindrops or fallen asleep to a chorus of chirping crickets. She has been deaf for as long as I've been alive. And ever since the day I first turned 5, my father has said, Joshua, nothing is wrong with Tamara. God just makes some people different. And at that moment, those 9 letters felt like hammers, swung gracefully by unholy hands to shatter my stained glass innocence into shards that can never be pieced back together or do anything more than sever the ties between my sister and I.
Joshua, what is it like to hear your 20-year-old self?
Goodness, I was going hard in that clip.
You were going hard.
I haven't listened to that poem in so many years. It's a bit surreal to hear it back. Yeah, I mean, goodness, I've been trying to commit to the art of telling the story of my life in public for a long time. That's one thing it makes me think of. I also think of the fact I had a Ralph Lauren suit on that I got off the clearance rack at Cross County Mall that my mother took me to get.
You want to look good for the president.
I had to on a budget. And, something that's not in my video is that my mother actually, she recited the poem with me before I went on stage, because I felt the kind of pressure of that moment and I didn't want to drop it. So as she had, since I was a little boy, she just kind of took me aside and we ran the lines together in front of one of the bathrooms, in the east wing of the White House. And, then I went up there and did my thing. And it really was a turning point in my life. After that, I won a major fellowship and got into graduate school and became a professional performer who, could tour and ask for more, than a plate of biscuits, when I got off stage. So
Great.
Yeah, it was a game changer for me.
Well, before we go, how do you pump yourself up to perform? How do you prepare? What's your creative process, if you can give us a little peek?
Sure, for many years, I was big on visualization. So I would close my eyes before a poem like that, let's say, and I would imagine my sister. I would imagine the space I was in when I first wrote the poem. And I still perform to this day. I'm on tour right now with the new books, and I always take a moment before I speak into the microphone to close my eyes, to ground myself, to think about why I'm there, and just try to go forward, and tell the truth. Because it's all you can do is operate in trust the audience to be present with you, to catch you, and to help propel the work to new heights. So that's how I try to, be in the space and honor the poems, because they're not just for me, right? I don't believe the poems just come from me. I try to be quiet and listen for the muse, and then I carry forth the word that the world might need.
Our country is 250 years old this year, and when we think of recitations or songs that are part of our collective practice of honoring this nation, I think a lot of people would think the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem would be appropriate. But is there a piece of writing or poetry or music that comes to mind when you think of this momentous occasion?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think important piece of autobiography here. I actually didn't sing the Star Spangled Banner till I was 5 or 6 years old, because I went to a school called the Modern School, which is founded by a Black woman named Mildred Johnson, whose father and uncle, John Rosamond Johnson and James Weldon Johnson,
Uh-oh, so I
wrote the
know what you
lyrics
had
and
to
music.
sing. Yes.
Yeah, right. So we had to sing the Black national anthem, lift every voice and sing every day when I was a little boy. And that song means a great deal to me. My dissertation chair, Imani Perry, from back when I was at Princeton, she's now a professor at Harvard, right? Brilliant writer, National Book Award winner. She wrote a book called May We Forever Stand. That's a kind of story of that song. But I've known and sang that since I was a little boy. I would also say Lucille Clifton's poem, Come Celebrate With Me, is another one of those works that has just meant a great deal to me, and feels like a meditation on what it means for us to tell our story of this nation and of our people who we invented together. I mean, so this book really is an ode to invention, both to inventions like the typewriter and the television and the trampoline, but also to the invention of Black classical music and to the invention of African American culture, which our people created under unthinkable duress, and which we continue to create even still.
Joshua Bennett is a professor of literature and distinguished chair of the humanities at MIT. He's the author of several books of poetry, criticism, and narrative nonfiction. His new poetry collection is We, the People of the United States. Professor Bennett, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
I'm Leoneda Inge, and this is Due South on WUNC News.
You're listening to a Due South Encore presentation.
This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Jeff Tabiri. As our nation celebrates its 250th birthday, we here at Due South are thinking and talking about that milestone through a Southern lens, and specifically, at times, a North Carolina one. We're not the only ones, of course. America 250 NC is an effort led by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. It's a statewide initiative inviting people across the state to reflect on the big ideas that helped shape us, the United States. We have two archivists from the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources here with us today to talk about a program that they've been working on in accordance with this big birthday. It's titled New Americans in North Carolina, and it's a project exploring records that document various ethnic groups coming to North Carolina from the late 1800s all the way to present day. Alana Gomez is an educator with America 250 NC, and John Horan is the oral historian for the State Archives, a division of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Welcome to Due South.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
No matter the political persuasion or ideology, maybe even where you were born or where you live now, there are all sorts of thoughts on the current state of our nation. However, the 250th birthday of the United States, big deal. As historians and archivists, I'm wondering how you even start to begin approaching this milestone. How do you honor it? What are you hoping on the front end to even get at? Alana?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. As the educator for America 250 NC, I definitely feel that responsibility, and I felt it coming in, and I feel it even now. And something I thought of is, of course, utilizing North Carolina history and revolutionary history. But one thing that was a big thing for me I wanted to tackle, and what led to this project, is how do we invite everyone in North Carolina to participate in this big commemoration, and what does that look like? And so for me, as the grandchild of immigrants, I thought a lot about how to invite people in who maybe couldn't trace their origins to the revolutionary times or even the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one way, and through oral history was another way of inviting people into this 250th commemoration and conversation.
John, what are New Americans? Can you define that for me?
Well, I mean, I think that it's sort of we called it New Americans because we wanted to kind of explore people, especially with the oral histories, immigrant experiences. We're talking about people who become American, therefore they are new Americans. Maybe they became American 30 years ago, and that's the story we're looking for. But at that point, they were new Americans.
Right.
And so that is kind of, in a nutshell, what New American means with regards to the Oral History Project.
You both have close family members who immigrated to the United States. I'm interested for you to tell us a little bit about your own family histories and how that influenced or helped shape the efforts here. John?
Yeah, certainly. So for me, it's very near and dear. I think, I mean, I just define New Americans as sort of immigrant experience, and that's the case from both of my parents. They met in the United States and had me in the United States. So I guess, I'd be the first kind of American to come out of that. But for them, my dad came from Ireland when he was, in his 20s, looking for a better situation. And then my mom came from Lebanon in the 80s when she was in her 30s as a result of the wars that were going on in that region.
Yeah. Alana, how about you? How did your ancestors, and when I say ancestors, I think we're talking about your grandparents here, how did they influence and inform your work on this project?
Yeah, so my mom is Italian and my father is Hispanic. So my mom's parents came from Italy, and similar to John, they had her here in America. And they were chasing that American dream that we hear so much about, and that this New Americans Project, a lot of the oral histories reflect. So they were coming here for a better life. They were coming here for new opportunities. And yeah, that has influenced me a lot in my life. And then my father's parents, his mother's from Cuba, so she came here in the 60s, and most historians will know that was during Fidel Castro's time. So, of course, she was a political refugee, and my grandfather was from Nicaragua. And the war hadn't started there, or the conflict hadn't started there, where the U.S. got involved, but he was coming here for a better life as well. And both my grandfathers owned their own businesses, being from these different countries. They owned their own businesses in America and were able to start a new life and be successful. And that kind of hard work ethic has always influenced me. And as a historian, I guess I'm just interested in my personal history, so I always look to include their stories and pay homage. Yeah, pay homage to their stories in my work too.
So New Americans in North Carolina, not a new concept, but I'm curious as to how you winnowed that down. Presumably you winnowed it down to some degree because we have this massive 500-mile wide state and we have all these different generations and points in history. What were you looking at and when?
Yeah, so this started as a project when I first got hired in June 2024, where my supervisor, Adrian Burney, who's our outreach coordinator at the State Archives, gave me room to explore this concept of New Americans. And she was particularly interested, and I was as well, in Hispanic Americans Hispanics in North Carolina. And that's sort of where I started. And I had only seen records in our naturalization records in the 20th century, so in the 1940s mostly. That doesn't mean Hispanics didn't come before then. That's just what we have documented. So the goal of this project was to talk about and show that Hispanics have been in North Carolina for a long time. And then since I was already looking at the 20th century, I sort of chose 3 different areas. So our 3 regions, Western, Central, and eastern North Carolina, and did sort of case studies of each.
Interesting. And tell us about the mountains, Piedmont, and coastal plains.
In the West, we looked at Buncombe County, which people are probably familiar with Asheville, and in central North Carolina, Alamance County. And there were a few in Durham County, too, actually, that we saw. There were a lot of Hispanic Americans popping up. And then in the East, we looked at Craven County.
Okay, interesting. And what did you find as it pertained to the records, the influx, the downturns, the rhythm of who was coming to which Latino populations were arriving in these places and why?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, in Buncombe County, we had the most, I think it was maybe 12 or 13 Latinos in the records, which was a lot and all populated in that area. And yes, and relatively speaking, correct. And that could be a result of many things, probably chain migration for one. But one of the highest populations there were men from Cuba, and they were mostly students, which was very interesting to me. And I actually called my grandmother about this, and she was like, I don't remember, Alana. But
but you asked.
Yes.
I appreciate you asking.
Yes, and I think she appreciated it too. But doing my own research, and she kind of alluded to this too, that there was probably just not great opportunities in Cuba at that time because at the time Fulgencio Batista was cracking down on education. So men were probably, and at the time only men were allowed to go to school, to be clear. So they were probably coming to America to pursue those opportunities.
Alana Gomez, educator with America 250 NC, and John Horan, oral historian with the State Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, with us here on Due South. We're chatting about a project they've been working on. It is titled the New Americans in North Carolina Project, and it's in accordance with our nation's 250th birthday. I want to turn to John in a moment, but first, Alana, talk to me about Amy Olga Babb. Who is she, and what's her story?
Yeah, that's a great New American to pull from our naturalization records. And she is a woman who came in 1940 from Panama. And this was another interesting case of maybe chain migration. There were a few women from Panama in her county at the time, which I believe was Guilford. And she attended the Palmer Memorial Institute, which is now today the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, which some of the listeners may have been to. And that was really interesting because obviously that is a state historic site that we have now. And it was interesting to see a female student, as I mentioned earlier. It was mostly male students that I was seeing in the records. And it was interesting thinking about her experience she might have had in Panama at the time and why she would have come here. At the time in Panama in the 1940s, of course, there was World War II happening. And then there was also a lot of political and racial turmoil in Panama between some of the white and black populations. So this might have been her best shot, and the Palmer Memorial Institute was a great school, so it's pretty cool.
Very interesting. John, if I've got it correctly, your focus here was a little more recent in that you were doing oral histories, and of course, in order to do an oral history, we need someone who is still kicking, so to speak. Tell us a little bit about your area of focus here. Again, kind of age and geography.
Sure. So geographically, we were talking about the entire state, and as far as age goes, we also ran the gamut there. The key for us in this project, which sort of the New Americans project has this oral history component. So I may use project to define both, but in this case, it's simply the oral history project that I'll be talking about. And we said, okay, how are we going to capture these voices? We thought, okay, if we go to a naturalization ceremony and talk to people after that, maybe that's the way to limit kind of the scope. And we found that wasn't a good enough solution for getting enough voices into this project. So instead, we went back to the board and wanted to do long-form interviews. And so Alana reached out to several of her contacts across the state, and we started setting up these interviews. And basically, interestingly enough, one of the key places we targeted was kind of English as a second language. We targeted community colleges. These are and educators, because these folks are the folks who are interfacing with A250, and so therefore we know who they are, and so we can then say, hey, since you're already interested in A250, would you be interested in joining us for this oral history project that's documenting kind of immigrant experiences in North Carolina?
If you would, John, I'd love for you to share with us a moment that you had during this oral history project where one of the subjects took you somewhere and you fill in the blank. It was powerful, it was educational, it was unexpected, but something that struck you and has stuck with you since.
I'm thinking back to the interview I did with Tujervan. He had such an interesting experience because he's Laotian. He was born in Laos, but his father was involved in our conflict in Vietnam. And so therefore he had to leave and set up in a refugee camp in Thailand, where he was for 10 years before he came to the United States. And then for another 10 years, he was in the United States, became an American citizen. And his perspective on what it was to be American. And then he also did not shy away from so that was in the early 90s that he became an American citizen. So it's, over 30 years ago. And he's had the perspective of those 30 years to then kind of talk about the current situation. And I didn't expect him to do that. Also didn't expect him to talk about, what it meant for him to be, an American, to have the Constitution, to have something to hold on to be patriotic, and then to talk about how, he's kind of felt abandoned by that more recently. And I'm not. These are things he shared in the public record. So I think that was I was unexpected to see that. But I was also unexpected to kind of hear how he's kept alive his, Laotian traditions and kind of infuse them with North Carolina barbecue. And he's, talks about having Thanksgiving dinner with 200 people. And so, having that many people, and then having, traditional Laotian cuisine with a turkey, all of it's there. It's like the definition of a melting pot.
And that is perhaps the definition of America. I would like to think so. I won't editorialize any further. Let's hear from Tujer Vang.
English is the hardest language for me because you have perfect English. When you're at school, you have to speak proper English. But when you go out in the country, you try to speak proper English, people don't understand you. So you have to have, hey, y'all, how y'all doing? Fresher table is over yonder, and so you have a little southern accent. Otherwise, you're trying to speak English, perfect English, your neighbor going to say, are you trying to be snobby with me? That makes sense? So I always have the code switching all the time.
You both had the opportunity here to dial it back, to look at records from centuries past, and hear from folks who I would imagine are decades and decades older than both of y'all. And I wonder how you, in the end, are viewing the 250th anniversary through the lens of what has been and living in America right now and looking, I would imagine, every day through the lens that is. What do you think of this birthday as we approach it?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think it's interesting for me because as a second-generation American, I do have the mindset of my grandparents who came here for the land of opportunity and the American dream, and the same mindset that a lot of our oral history subjects, or oral history narrators, I should say, had as well. But obviously, as a young person, as a historian, I have my own ideas about history and the things that have happened over time. But I will say I still see the 250th as something I'm very excited for and feel very, I don't want to say attached to, but hopeful for. And being able to look back into records and talk to people who have come from different countries has really put that into perspective about the long history we have, and hopefully the long history we will continue to have.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, I think hopeful is a good starting point for me on this A250 look. And I think the other, and that's going through the records, listening to these oral histories, it's hopeful, but it's incomplete. And I'll add more to the incomplete side, because if you think about the United States, we're celebrating 250. It's not 250 and now we're done. it's 250, and then we're going to have 251, and we're going to have 252. And so we're always refining, we're always iterating on a concept that several men and women in 1776 came together to create and start, and to think of it as something that is complete is folly. I think it becomes it can weigh people down. It can create, a lack of hopefulness, to be honest with you, because if it's complete, we can't change it. But if we can change it because it's incomplete, we can be hopeful about its future.
Alana Gomez is an educator with America 250 NC, and John Horan is the oral historian for the State Archives, which is a division of the State Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Thank you both for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is Due South on WUNC News.
Each story you hear on Planet Money starts with a question. What happens if we refund tariffs? Why are groceries so expensive? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious, because the forces shaping our world can be hard to see. Follow NPR's Planet Money wherever you get your podcasts and start seeing how the economy really works.